Hi there and welcome back to Japan, where today we're going to be discussing, are album covers getting any worse? And I'll be presenting it from here, where I will be sitting in one location today. This is the most comfortable location I could find to do these. Now I have to do them outside. Don't worry, we will change the name more accurately of this channel to Homeless Broadcast. Now when discussing album covers, we have to look at two main factors which I would describe as marketing and medium. Now let's start off with the medium, because this one's probably the most obvious one, but it is one that was worth mentioning. And that's the fact that obviously when we first look at album covers, they obviously came out on big records. They were huge things that you could basically hang on your wall, and people still do. I mean, I'm always kind of confused when people buy records these days, because, spoiler alert, the quality is not as good as digital. But I do get it when they buy it as a collector's item, because you hang it on a wall and it's a really beautiful piece of art, if it's a good album cover, of course. I mean, you can get a poster, but posters are obviously stretched in their aspect ratio, where record, then obviously after that CDs came along, and there was a lot of people who complained at the time when CDs took over about the smaller album covers, and I can completely get that. And then of course after you had that, everything has now switched over to being digital, where the only real album cover you get is more like an icon. It's the thing that you press, it's the picture that maybe at most comes up on your phone. It's not even physically there. Now, as many of you might know, CDs themselves increased in popularity up until pretty much exactly the turn of the millennium, in the West at least, and then from that point onwards they started going downwards, maybe future thinking or just changes of attitudes, but it seemed to be about the right time for CDs to die out and digital to take over as the technology supported it. And as CDs started to die out and people were downloading more and more, and the industry was taking forever to catch up with the fact that this is something they should monetize, it was mostly illegal in the early days, kids. Basically, one slowly replaced the other, and this all pretty much took place neatly between the year 2000 and approximately 2010 for the majority of that handover. Now, the interesting thing is I have a very vivid memory of going into a CD shop, another thing that used to exist, kids, back in, I think it was either 2009 or 2010, it was right around the change of the decade. And I remember seeing, this was back in the UK, I remember just seeing a load of CDs and suddenly noticing that of all the charting ones, the ones doing really well, a huge number of them were just a face. And it was equally fair to say that those album covers did actually stand out. You know, they really grabbed your attention more than a lot of the other artistic ones there. But it was very clear that that's what they've been going for. Now, it would be very easy to just say that this was all the result of album covers getting smaller, but I think that that's only part of the deal. And I say this partly because of the fact that obviously album covers, you know, how big it is partly depends on how close you stand to it. I mean, even when album covers were big records, if you had one which was just a face, it is going to grab your attention a lot more. It would be fair to say there were some very simple, direct album covers back then as well. I mean, don't get me wrong, something like the famous Sgt. Pepper album cover from the Beatles made a lot of sense with records, but if you release that as an album cover now, would arguably be a much more questionable choice, because you think most people aren't even going to see the detail. However, you can't still deny the fact that a very visually catching album cover is always going to grab you first, simply from the marketing standpoint, and that's what we need to move on to now, marketing. In the same way that basically company logos have been getting simpler over time and using more clear, bold fonts with clear colours, it's fair to say that the same thing was always going to happen with album covers as well. I mean, let's face it, you are trying to get people to buy your stuff, but just as with business logos, that does mean that you slowly move towards this territory where there's less variety, less variation, and as I mentioned with that image of walking into the CD shop and seeing all of these charting CDs with just a face on them, it does mean that you get a much more samey output at the end. I mean, yeah, it's a shame, but personally I feel kind of hard-pressed to complain about it. One thing that I noticed is one of my favourite Japanese artists, and one of the first artists who I really got into from Japan, Otsukarai, she actually did this before it was cool, I guess you could say. Starting from 2003, when her first album came out, she went on a trend of using basically the same formula, similar named albums using the word love at the beginning each time, and then having an album cover where she just looked directly into camera every single time. And this lasted up until very recently. In fact, I'm not going to say this is necessarily connected, but it's interesting that her sales started to drop off around about the time that she stopped making eye contact with the camera. Apart from the visual simplicity and recognisableness of it, it is just true that eye contact is something that humans really respond to. And also, if you're a fan of the artist as well, you're gonna kind of like looking at the artist you like looking back at you in most cases, especially if they're attractive. Which brings me on interestingly to Band-Maid. Now Band-Maid themselves, they had the cover for Conqueror, which I remember was not particularly inventive. It had a nice sort of artistic style to it, but it was the nearest they'd ever come to that, just someone looking at you. And of course they didn't even get the whole band for that, it was just one face per cover, and you had the optional different covers, Miku being the default one for the standard version of the release. Lead member after all, I guess. But this was an interesting example because I remember on our forums talking about this in the Discord, a lot of people really liked that and they were excited about, as I was, getting the cover with their favourite member on it because, you know, it gives you a sense of attachment. Interestingly enough though, when Unseen World came out more recently, I heard a very mixed to maybe even slightly negative response to the album cover. I mean, people didn't hate it, but it just wasn't something that was grabbing people. Now, I must admit, when I saw the Unseen World cover, although it's not something that I think of as being like one of the greatest covers ever or anything like that, my feeling moreover was just of being kind of relieved. I remember looking at it and thinking, maybe you could call it pretentious and artistic, and then I realised it was actually their hands in it, and I thought, that's kind of cool actually. But moreover, I was just happy to see an album cover that was distinctly different, just because someone had done something a bit artistic with it. In fact, I'd probably argue it's the most interesting of all of their album covers. I mean, I know Just Bring It's very interesting, but that itself is a copy of a, I believe, famous older piece of art, so I don't know whether I can necessarily give that the same claim of originality. What is that noise? So in a world where album covers are getting simpler to compensate for the smaller size of the medium, and where they're also getting a little bit more, shall we say, direct in order to deal with the fact that they want to engage with getting you to look at them, it has become a situation where I just feel very heartwarmed by any album cover that's just an interesting piece of art, which maybe the artist feels kind of sums up the mood of the piece more than just trying to grab your attention. Although, look, I understand marketing for the side of music and how the music industry really requires that. We want our favourite artists to make money and get through to new people, so I'm not going to complain about good marketing. Just saying. So my question to you would be, as normal, what do you think? Do you agree on these points? Why do you think the changes have been? Are there reasons you think that I haven't maybe caught on to? And what are your opinions about that? But moreover, I want you to give me some examples of maybe artists whose album covers have got better, or have maybe got worse as a result, or maybe contrary to these changes in the way that album covers tend to be done. And it would also be great if you can maybe tell us what your favourite album covers of the last 20 years at least have been, certainly within the last 10 years, as well as maybe the ones you've found most disappointing, and maybe let us know why. Anyway, time for me to get out of here. Now I was just thinking of more album covers, Be Quiet announcement, but I was also thinking of things like how on the Mixed Temp, Mixed Juice album by Silent Siren, how they kind of managed to get the best of all of their faces in there. Also thinking of bands like Scandal, who've gone kind of the opposite way. They used to be on their album covers and now they haven't. I don't know if that's necessarily worked for them. I must admit that I was impressed by the artistic nature of their most recent album cover, but I can't help but feel that it didn't really do anything for me. Of course, you've got artists like Baby Metal who've just basically stuck to using their own band logo every single time. I must admit, I don't particularly get excited looking forward to their album covers, and yet I'm kind of weirdly impressed at how, kind of like I was saying with the Oatscry covers, they take the same band logo and they basically just change the, shall we say, the ethos around it each time to match the album name. However, as always, that's just my waffle, so time for you to get into the comments, get on the Discord if you want. Thank you to everyone who's on our social media. As always, a massive thank you to our patrons for keeping this channel going, and until I see you hopefully very soon on a video or in the comments, for now, it's windy outside. Ciao, ciao.